Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 2. American Government. Principles of American Democracy. Part 2. Setting up the federal government. The government of the United States has three major divisions, or branches. The three branches of U.S. government are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each branch has a different role to play in government. The three branches of government are defined by the Constitution. The Constitution explains the duties and the limitations of the offices that make up each branch of government. For instance, the Constitution tells us how senators and representatives are elected to the legislative branch, which is also called Congress. Congress's main job is to make new laws. The steps members of Congress must take to change or add to U.S. law are laid out in the Constitution. The Constitution also explains how the President and other members of the executive branch are chosen. It outlines the responsibilities of people serving in the executive branch. The judicial branch is also defined by the Constitution. The Constitution says how judges are selected to serve on the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court, and it explains what the Supreme Court and the other courts that make up the judicial branch can and can't do. Civics test question. Name one branch or part of the government. Name one branch or part of the government. Congress. Congress, or the legislative branch, is a part of U.S. government. The other two branches of federal government are the executive branch and the judicial branch. Parts of these branches include the office of the president and the courts. Each branch of government has different powers, or things it can do. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution in 1787, they were concerned about the possibility of one part of government becoming more powerful than the rest. To stop a single person or group of people in government from getting all the power and taking away Americans' right to self-government, the writers of the Constitution set up a system of separation of powers, giving each branch of government a different set of abilities. For example, the president has the ability, or the power, to appoint federal judges, but only Congress has the power to approve the judges appointed by the president. Congress makes new laws, but if there's any disagreement about whether a new law is allowed by the Constitution, only the courts, or the judicial branch, can resolve that dispute. The courts interpret the law. If most of the judges on the Supreme Court decide a law goes against the Constitution, they can declare the law unconstitutional. If that happens, the unconstitutional law is canceled, no matter how many people in Congress or in the executive branch think it's a good idea. Because of separation of powers, each branch of government has certain ways of stopping or slowing down the other two. This is called checks and balances. Checks, in this context, are things different parts of government can do to stop or slow down actions taken by other parts of government. We've already mentioned how the Supreme Court can check Congress by declaring a law unconstitutional. The executive branch also has ways it can check Congress, and Congress has ways it can check the other two branches. For example, when Congress makes a proposal for a new law, the president can check Congress by vetoing or saying no to the proposal. When the president makes a treaty with the government of another country, Congress can check the president by rejecting the treaty. Since each branch has ways of keeping the other branches from making all the important decisions on their own, in theory, the branches balance one another out. Ideally, the system of checks and balances set up by the Constitution stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Civics test question. What stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? What stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? Separation of powers. The Constitution makes sure no one branch of government has all the power by instituting a system of separation of powers. The Constitution also gives each branch of government ways to stop the other two from becoming too powerful by establishing a system of checks and balances. The idea of separation of powers also played a large part in the creation of the U.S. federal system, which divides U.S. government into two levels. At the lower level, there are state governments. Each state of the United States has its own government, chosen by the people of that state. State governments make laws and regulations that apply only within that state. At the higher level of U.S. government, though, we have a central or federal government that oversees the entire country. While state governments can make their own decisions about many things, they cannot make laws that go against federal law. In the United States, there are certain kinds of actions only the federal government can take, certain responsibilities and powers that belong to the state governments, and certain powers the federal and state governments have in common. One power shared by the federal government and state governments is the ability to collect taxes. Every year, all U.S. citizens and residents are responsible for paying whatever federal taxes they owe to the country's government, no matter where they live. Residents of different states are also responsible for paying state taxes. The federal and state governments use the taxes they collect to fund federal and state court systems, law enforcement, road maintenance, and other public services and programs. Some powers are not shared. Only the federal government, for example, has the power to print money. This rule applies not only to actual printed paper bills, but also to coins and to digital forms of currency accessed via online banking, credit cards, and similar money management tools. This is why you'll never see people paying for goods or services with Connecticut dollars or Texas dollars, only with US dollars. Also, only the federal government is allowed to create an army, declare war, or make treaties with other countries. According to the nation's constitution, state governments cannot raise a military or decide on their own to go to war against other countries. Only the federal legislative branch has the power to maintain a national military and to declare war. State governments also do not make treaties with the governments of other countries. Connecticut cannot make a treaty with the government of Brazil, for instance. Instead, it's the President of the United States, with the approval of the Senate, who makes treaties with other countries. Civics test question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government? Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government? To print money. According to the Constitution, only the federal government has the power to print money. Other powers of the federal government described in the Constitution are the power to declare war, the power to create an army, and the power to make treaties. While some powers belong only to the federal government, state governments also have powers and responsibilities of their own. Each state's public school system, for example, is regulated by that state's government. All state governments have the responsibility to ensure their residents are provided with educational opportunities, but the school rules teachers, parents, and students are required to follow, and what families can expect from the educational institutions in their area vary somewhat from state to state. Each state is also responsible for maintaining a police force to provide protection for state residents and visitors. State governments are involved in setting up and maintaining the fire departments that respond to emergency calls to provide safety from gas leaks, house fires, and other dangerous situations. The federal government does not give a driver's license either. That's the state government's job. This is why, if you have a driver's license from one state and move to another, you're required to get your license replaced. If someone who has been living in Pennsylvania moves to Maryland, for example, they need to hand in their old Pennsylvania license and apply for a Maryland replacement license shortly after they make the trip to their new home. State governments also approve zoning and land use. If you want to build something on a piece of land you've purchased, you will usually need to ask the state government for approval, not the federal government. State governments set regulations about what kinds of structures can be built where. They make decisions about how different pieces of land can be used, and set many other rules about property development. Civics test question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? To give a driver's license. State governments are the ones to provide people with driver's licenses. Other powers of the states include the power to provide schooling and education, the power to provide protection via the police, the power to provide safety via fire departments, and the power to approve zoning and land use. After the Constitutional Convention in 1787, people in the 13 original states voted on whether or not to approve the federal system of government described by the Constitution. Each state's population had to decide whether or not to accept the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. 3 founding fathers who wanted the U.S. to have a strong central government wrote a series of essays to convince their fellow Americans to vote in favor of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay published columns in the newspaper arguing that the system of government that would work best for the U.S. was the federal system set up by the Constitution. Today, we call Hamilton, Madison, and Jay's essays the Federalist Papers. Even though the Federalist Papers were written by 3 people, however, some copies you might see in a bookstore or at the library list Publius as the name of the author of all 85 of these essays. This is because instead of giving their real names, Hamilton, Jay, and Madison all used the pen name Publius when first publishing their arguments in favor of the Constitution. Publius means the public, or the people, going along with the idea that the Constitution sets up a government created by we, the people. People today still read what Hamilton, Jay, and Madison wrote about the Constitution because these writers' explanations of checks and balances, separation of powers, and other principles of U.S. government are considered very clear and well argued. It's difficult to say how much influence the Federalist Papers had at the time they were first published on people deciding whether or not to vote to approve the Constitution. We do know, however, that the essays Hamilton, Jay, and Madison wrote were printed throughout the 13 original states, and we know that they were popular topics of discussion with Americans deciding which way they would vote on the Constitution. Eventually, possibly due in part to the influence of the Federalist Papers, all 13 states voted in favor of ratifying or approving the Constitution. The first state to vote yes to the passage of the Constitution was Delaware. Many public monuments and memorials in Delaware contain reminders of the state's landmark decision to ratify the U.S. Constitution. For example, the words, "We the People," are inscribed on some commemorative pieces in Delaware in recognition of the state's early support for the idea of self-government described in the Constitution. Many Delaware license plates display the nickname, "the First State," as another reminder that Delaware was the first to ratify the Constitution. The people of Delaware voted to approve the Constitution the same year it was written, 1787. The date Delaware ratified the Constitution is included on the state flag. December 7th, 1787, is printed in white along the bottom of the banner. The Delaware flag also displays the words Liberty and Independence on a white ribbon in honor of the role Delaware played in the Revolutionary War and in the founding of U.S. government. Other states did not take long to follow Delaware in voting to accept the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Like Delaware, Pennsylvania and New Jersey ratified the Constitution in 1787, the same year it was written. In the next few years, thanks to persuasive arguments from Federalists like Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, the other 10 original states all voted yes to accepting the government set up by the Constitution. Civics test question. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. Hamilton. Many of the Federalist Papers, which supported the passage of the Constitution, were written by Alexander Hamilton. James Madison and John Jay were the other two writers of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay used the pen name Publius. Though he was not one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, George Washington was a staunch supporter of the Constitution and of the system of government it describes. Washington's support for a Federalist system of government influenced the outcome of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Later, public statements from Washington also helped convince his admirers in many states to vote to ratify the Constitution. After the passage of the U.S. Constitution, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. In Connecticut's old state house, in the state capital, Hartford, there is a portrait of Washington made late during his time in office. This painting contains many symbols of the part Washington played in early U.S. history. The background of the portrait of Washington in Connecticut's old state house contains a large window. Dark clouds in one corner of this window represent the difficulties faced by the 13 original colonies leading up to the Revolutionary War and the troubles the American colonists had to contend with during their struggle for independence. Sunlight and rainbows in the other corner of the window, closer to where Washington is standing, represent the end of the war and the promise of peace ahead. Washington is depicted in this painting with a sword sheathed at his side. Washington was famously the leader of the American military during the Revolutionary War, and afterward he became commander-in-chief of the U.S. military again when he was elected president. In this picture, however, Washington has put away his sword. The fact that he has covered his weapon suggests that he considers the time for physical fighting to be over. Instead of war, during his presidency, Washington was focused on supporting the new government set up by the Constitution. Washington's hand resting on a stack of papers on the desk beside him implies that his efforts are centered on constitutional affairs. Washington's contributions to the establishment of the U.S. federal system of government are another reason he is sometimes called the father of our country. Civics test question. Who is the father of our country? Who is the father of our country? Washington. George Washington played a large role in American independence, and he had a significant influence on early U.S. government, which is why he is sometimes called the father of our country. Civics test question. Who was the first president? Who was the first president? Washington. George Washington was the first person to be elected president of the United States.